Bueno, muy bien. The Afro-Diasporic body in Haitian Voodoo and the Transcending of gendered Cartesian Corporeality. Now that is what we call a title. 2008, open access. Let's get to it. Shout out to Roberto Strongman. As a social construct, the body is pieced together differently in every cultural context. The discourse of embodiment in the Western philosophical tradition contrasts sharply with the more modular conceptualization of the body found in Afro-Diasporic religious cultures. An explication of some canonical texts of Western philosophical and some filmic and literary texts from Haiti can demonstrate how these contrasting understandings of the body produce unique gendered and sexual categories of being. The Western philosophical tradition presents the concept of a unitary soul within the hermetic enclosure of a body. In Sources of the Self, the historian of philosophy, Charles Taylor, presents a genealogy of the Western self in which Descartes marks the most important milestone. He writes, "The internationalization wrought by the modern age, of which Descartes' formulation was one of the most important and influential, is very different from Augustine's. It does, in a very real sense, place the moral sources within us. Relative to Plato and relative to Augustine, it brings about in each case a transposition by which we no longer see ourselves as related to moral sources outside us, or at least not at all in the same way. An important power has been internalized." It is important to place Taylor's claims concerning Descartes in the historical context of the Enlightenment. The theocentric philosophical tradition delineated by Plato and Augustine is characterized by man's search for an identity that lies beyond itself, beyond himself, in the divine without. The intense secularization of the Enlightenment disrupts this theocentrism by foregrounding the individual, a move that brings about the internationalization of identity. This sense of inwardness, however, is dependent upon a clear demarcation between the new boundaries of the self and the body. In the following passage, Descartes reasons how even if the mind or soul might be within the body, the two remain distinct parts of the individual. In order to begin this examination, then, I here say, in the first place, that there is a great difference between mind and body, inasmuch as body is by nature always divisible, and mind is entirely indivisible. For as a matter of fact, when I consider the mind, that is to say, myself, inasmuch as I am only a thinking thing, I cannot distinguish in myself any parts, but apprehend myself to be clearly one and entire. And although the whole mind seems to be united to the whole body, yet if a foot or an arm or some other part is separated from my body, I am aware that nothing has been taken away from my mind. And the faculties of willing, feeling, conceiving, etc. cannot be properly properly speaking said to be its parts, for it is one and the same mind which employs itself in willing and in feeling and understanding. But it is quite otherwise with corporeal or extended objects, for there is not one of these imaginable by me which my mind cannot easily divide into parts, and which consequently I do not recognize as being divisible. This would be sufficient to teach me that the mind or soul of man is entirely different from the body, if I had not already learned it from other sources. Clearly, Descartes' concern here is to negate the full absorption of the soul by the mind in the process of subjective internalization. The two remain distinct entities, even if one resides within the other. Apart from remarking on Descartes' famous cogito in his description of the I as the thinking thing, his concern for divisibility and indivisibility as tests for integrity should be noted. Descartes believes that the possibility of the body to be separated into parts implies that it is of a different nature than the indivisible mind or soul. In fact, Western philosophy will not be able to develop a discourse for the parts of the mind until the 20th century with Freud's The Ego and the Id, and most importantly with Sartre's L'être et le néant, a text that claims that l'altérité est en effet une négation interne et seule une conscience peut se constituer comme négation interne. Alterity is really an internal negation, and only a conscience can constitute itself as an internal negation. Nevertheless, through his reasoning, Descartes crystallizes the notion of a self within a body, establishing this self as internal, unitary, and inseparable from the body. In the 20th century, a strong Western philosophical current attempts to amend the internal subject of Descartes'. Bataille, for example, posits the divine as self inside the body. J'entends par expérience intérieure ce que d'habitude on nomme expérience mystique, l'état d'extase, de ravissement, au moins d'émotion méditée. By internal experience, I mean that which normally is called mystical experience, ecstasies, rapture as a form of mediating emotion. Bataille here suggests that even though inwardness initially required secularization, once it is established, it can become sacramental again without forcing the self to exit the body. Similarly, Michel Serret, in Variations sur le corps, uses an aesthetic discourse to claim that the body's internalization of the self does not imply a rejection of the profound and transcendental mystery of artistic appreciation. Voilà le cycle admirable de support réciproqué entre le labyrinthe de l'oriel interne chargé du port et les volutes spiralées de l'externe qui entend et produit la musique, convergeant dans un centre noir et secret, commun à ces deux réseaux, où je découvrais soudain la solution au mystère sombre de l'union de l'âme que, oui, la langue et du corps porteur. Let's consider the admirable cycles of reciprocal support between the labyrinth of the internal ear and the spiraling corrugations of the external ear, which hears and produces music, converging into one dark and secret center, common to both networks, where I suddenly discover the solution to the shadowy mysteries of the union between the soul that hears language and the body which carries it. While Bataille and Serret are interested in recuperating the divine for the internal self, for Sartre, toute autre conception de l'altérité reviendrait à la poser comme un soi, c'est-à-dire à établir entre elle et l'être une relation externe, ce qui nécessiterait la présence d'un témoin pour constater que l'autre est autre que l'un soi. All other conceptualization of alterity will end up presenting it as in itself, in other words, to establish between it and being an external relationship which would require the presence of a witness to verify that the other is different from that which is in itself. Recent scientific experiments in the area of perception and cognition present further evidence that the relationship between the self and the body is not a universal given, but imagined and constructed. Out-of-body experiments conducted by two research groups using slightly different methods expanded upon the rubber hand illusion. In that illusion, people hide one hand in their lap and look at the rubber hand set on a table in front of them. As a researcher strokes the real hand and the rubber at the same time with a stick, people have the sensation that the rubber hand is their own. When a hammer hits the rubber hand, the subjects recoil and cringe. Two different research teams led by Henrik Essen and Binga Lengenhager, respectively, created whole body illusions with similar manipulations, this time through the use of virtual reality technology. The subjects wore goggles connected to two video cameras placed 6 feet behind them, and as a result saw their own backs from the perspective of a virtual person located behind them. When the researcher stroked the subject's chest and moved the second stick under the camera lenses simultaneously, the subjects reported the sense of being outside of their own bodies, looking at themselves from a distance where the cameras were located. The scientists infer from these experiments that they now understand how the brain combines visual and tactile information to compute and determine where the self is located in space. These experiments are relevant in that they demonstrate that the location of the self vis-à-vis the body can and is culturally constructed through the senses. The body and itself need not be coterminous. The self need not reside inside the body, but may be imagined or placed externally. In different ways, current scientific discourse coincides with Afro-Diasporic philosophy in their exposure of subjective inwardness as an illusion. In Caliban's Reason, introducing Afro-Caribbean philosophy, Hergé Henry explains that Afro-Diasporic philosophy does not exist as a tradition isolated from other manifestations of culture, because traditional African philosophy emerged implicitly in the ontological, ethical, existential, and other positions taken in religious, mythic, genealogical, and folkloric discourses. Its presence and visibility depended upon the continued vitality and growth of these systems of thought. Their contraction or decay would mean decline and eclipse for traditional African philosophy. In the Caribbean, traditional African philosophy experienced an even greater eclipse as a result of the rise of colonial discourses and illiterate, hybridized local intelligentsia. Henry's statement implies the need to investigate Afro-Diasporic religion as a repository of philosophical information that can overcome the imposition of Western philosophical discourses on colonized peoples. In fact, a thorough study of Afro-Diasporic religions reveals how, unlike the Western idea of the fixed internal unitary soul, the Afro-Diasporic self is removable, external, and multiple. In African philosophical thought, the Akan conceptual scheme, Kwame Gyekye, presents a tripartite plan of the self comprised of the Honam, the material body, the Okra, the immaterial soul, and the Sunsum, the quasi-material spirit. In cultural universals and particulars, an African perspective, Kwesi Wiredu explains Dietzsche's systemization of Akan personhood by comparing it with Descartes' mind-body binarism. One thing in any case should be absolutely clear. Neither the Okra nor the Sunsum can be identified with the immaterial soul familiar in some influential Western philosophical and religious thinking, with all its attendant paradoxes. This concept of the soul is routinely used interchangeably with the concept of mind, while the concept of Okra and Sunsum are categorically different from the Akan concept of mind at Juing, as our previous explanation should have rendered apparent. Thus, Descartes, in English translation, can speak indifferently of the soul or mind, and appear to make sense in Akan. To identify either the Okra or the Sunsum with Adrin would be the sheerest gibberish. The multiplicity of the self displayed in the Akan scheme is prevalent in West African societies and has been noted by Haitian Voodoo scholar Guérin Montilus in his study of Aja philosophy. The Voodoo religion of the Aja taught these same Africans that their psychic reality and source of human life was metaphorically symbolized by the shadow of the body. The principle represented by the shadow is called the Ye. There are two of these. The first is the inner, the internal part of the shadow, which is called the Ye Gli. That is a short Ye. The second, the external and light part of the same shadow, is called the Ye Gaga. That is the long Ye. The first, Ye Gli, is the principle of physical life, which vanishes at death. The second, Ye Gaga, is the principle of consciousness and psychic life. The Ye Gaga survives death and illustrates the principle of immortality. It has metaphysical mobility that allows human beings to travel far away at night through dreams or remain eternally alive after the banishment of the Ye Gli. After death, the Ye Gaga goes to meet the community of ancestors, which constitutes the extended family and the clan in their spiritual dimensions. This multiplicity of the self found in the African philosophy survives in the Caribbean diaspora. The African duality of the immaterial self, the Okra and Sunsum of the Akan, and the Yegli and Yegaga of the Aja, become the Tibonange and the Guobanange in Haitian Voodoo. In Creole religions of the Caribbean, an introduction from Voodoo and Santeria to Obeah and Espiritismo. Marguerite Fernandez Olmos and Elizabeth Paravicini Geber define these two elusive terms. The head, which contains the two elements that comprise the soul, the Tibonange and the Tibonange, or the Tibonange, the conscience that allows for self-reflection and self-criticism, and the Gros Bonange or the Gros Bonange, the psyche, source of memory, intelligence, and personhood, must be prepared so that the Gros Bonange can be separated from the initiate to allow the spirit to enter in its place. Here, a cooperative relationship between the Tibonange and the Gros Bonange might be seen. Alfred Metro further expounds on this cooperation. It is the general opinion that dreams are produced by the wanderings of the Gros Bonange when it abandons the body during sleep. The sleeper becomes aware of the adventures of the Gros Bonange through the Tizange, who remains by him as a protector and yet never loses sight of the Gros Bonange. He wakes the sleeper in case of danger and even flies to the rescue of the Gros Bonange if this faces real danger. For the self to achieve altered states of consciousness in transpossessions, dreams, or death, The T-Bonange allows the Gros Bonange, the Guo Bonange, to become detached from the person. For the self to achieve altered states of consciousness in transpossessions, dreams, or death, the T-Bonange allows the Guo Bonange to become detached from the person. In the case of transpossession, the Guo Bonange surrenders its place and its authority to the Metet, M-E-T-T-E-T, the main spirit served by that person, and the one, she or he, most often goes into transform. In her landmark book, Mama Lola, a Voodoo Priestess in Brooklyn, Karen McCarthy Brown further explains the multiple concept of the self in Voodoo by presenting the notion of the Metet, roughly translated as the master of the head. The personality of the Metet and that of the devotee tend to coincide, an intimate tie hinted at in the occasional identification of the big guardian angel Guo Bonange, one dimension of what might be called a person's soul, with the Voodoo spirit who is his or her Metet. Here the Guo Bonange is the central element of the self in Voodoo. Not only is it the seat of individuality, but it also maintains links between the Metet and the T-Bonange, two aspects of the self that are not directly connected to each other. These links are broken after the death of the individual in the Vodou ceremony of the Sunin. In a certain sense, the Metet is the divine parent of the Gros Bonange, Gros-Bon-Ange. In a certain sense, the Metet is the divine parent of the Gros Bonange, the psychic inheritance from the parents. The ceremony of the Desunin thus accomplishes two separate but related actions. It severs the lower cord of the Gros Bonange and it separates the Gros Bonange from its physical parent, the now defunct matter of the body, launching it as an independent spiritual entity into the spiritual universe, where it in turn becomes either part of the general spiritual heritage of the descendants of that person, or even, perhaps, the divine parent, the lower Metet, of some subsequent Gros Bonange. The roles of the two most important aspects of the self may be summarized by saying that the Guo Bonange is consciousness, while the T-Bonange is objectivity. The Guo Bonange is the principal soul, experience, personality. Agosto de Munoz. The personal soul or self. The T-Bonange is described as the anonymous, protective, objective conscience that is the truthful and objective, the impersonal spiritual component of the individual, whose domain also encompasses moral considerations and arbitration. The T-Bonange is a spiritual reserve tank. It is an energy or presence within the person that is dimmer or deeper than consciousness. But it is nevertheless there to be called upon in situations of stress and depletion. The complex relationship between the Guo Bonange and the T-Bonange has at times not been correctly understood by Western scholars, who have disseminated erroneous information, further muddying our collective understanding of the self in Vodou. For example, Desmangles ascribes to the T-Bonange characteristics that most scholars attribute to the Guo Bonange. The T-Bonange is the ego soul. It represents the unique qualities that characterize an individual's personality. Comparisons to Western philosophy underscore his confusion. The Vodou concept of the T-Bonange in heaven seems to correspond to the Roman Catholic doctrine of the soul. For Vaudouisants believe that it appears before Bon Dieu to stand before the heavenly tribunal where it is arraigned for its misdeeds and must suffer the appropriate penalties. Similarly, Wade Davis ascribes to the T-Bonange attributes that most scholars use to define the Gwo-Bonange. The T-Bonange is the individual aura, the source of all personality and willpower. Furthermore, Davis says that the T-Bonange travels during sleep, while most scholars agree that it is the Gwo-Bonange who does so. In addition to the Gwo-Bonange, T-Bonange, and the Metet, there remain three components of the Vodou concept of personhood. The Nam is the spirit of the flesh that allows each cell to function, or the animating force of the body. The Zetwal, Z-E-T-W-A-L. The Zetwal is the celestial parallel self, fate, and the spiritual component that resides in the sky. It is the individual star of destiny. The Corkadav, K-O-R-K-A-D-A-V. The Corkadav is the body itself, the flesh and blood, the dead body of the person, and the material substance separable from these various animating spiritual entities. The phenomenon of transpossession needs to be explained through the multiplicity of self in Vodou. The projection of Western philosophical concepts by anthropologists onto Vodou has been responsible for inaccurate understandings of transpossession. The symptoms of the opening phase of the trance are clearly pathological. They conform exactly in their main features to the stock clinical conception of hysteria. Nevertheless, it is important to note how other scholars from the Haitian national elite have questioned the use of Western philosophy to understand Afro-Diasporic transpossession. Quoi qu'il en soit, si le phénomène de la possession, la transe ou l'extase chez les crisseurs de Vodou est une psychonévrose, peut-on la classer dans la catégorie de l'hystéria selon l'un ou l'autre doctrine ci-dessus exposée? Nous ne le croyons pas. Les possédés de la loi ne sont pas des crisseurs dont on peut provoquer l'attaque par suggestion et qu'on peut guérir par persuasion. Even if the phenomenon of possession, trance, or ecstasy implies among Vodou practitioners a psychological breakdown, can one classify it with the category of hysteria, according to one or another doctrine here presented? We do not believe this to be a correct approach. Those possessed by law are not psychotics, who can be induced into a state by the power of suggestion or healed through persuasion. However, even as Metro inaccurately equates transpossession with the already questionable notion of hysteria, he does provide one of the clearest definitions of the phenomenon during the 1950s, the early period of serious scholarly investigation on Vodou. The explanation of mystic trance given by disciples of Voodoo is simple. A loa moves into the head of an individual, having first driven out the good big angel, Gros Bon Ange, one of the two souls everyone carries in himself. This eviction of the soul is responsible for the tremblings and convulsions that characterize the opening stages of trance. Once the good angel has gone, the person possessed experiences a feeling of total emptiness, as though he were fainting. His head whirls. The calves of his legs tremble. He now becomes not only the vessel, but also the instrument of the god. From now on, it is the god's personality, and not his own, which is expressed in his bearing and words. The play of these features, his gestures, and even the tone of his voice all reflect the temperament and character of the god who has descended upon him. Maitreux's work helps to locate the seat of selfhood in the corporeal head of the individual. In Haitian Creole, tête has an interesting double meaning. It is a noun referring to the anatomical head, and in its function as a reflexive prefix attached to personal pronouns, it also means self. This synecdoche becomes important as it establishes the head as a referent for selfhood. It also presents the head as the physical location for the multiple parts of the self. Writing in the interstices between African and European philosophies, Maitreux describes transpossession using an ambiguous language implying penetration and hovering. Ambiguous language implying penetration and hovering. This vacillation between metaphors for possession continues in the following passage. The relationship between the loa and the man seized is compared to that which joins a rider to his horse. That is why a loa is spoken of as mounting or saddling his chual, horse. It is also an invasion of the body by a supernatural spirit. Hence, the often used expression, the loa is seizing his horse. Maitreux's use of in or out metaphors for the phenomenon of possession is a Western importation. The rider metaphor popularized by early scholars of Voodoo like Zora Neale Hurston, Tell My Horse, and Catherine Dunham, Island Possessed, articulates the language used by the initiates themselves. Afro-Diasporic religions operate under a transcorporeal conceptualization of the self that is radically different from the Western philosophical tradition. Unlike the unitary soul of Descartes, the immaterial aspect of the Afro-Diasporic self is multiple. Unlike the unitary soul of Descartes, the immaterial aspect of the Afro-Diasporic self is multiple, external, and removable. These various subjectivities rest upon a concave corporeal surface reminiscent of a saddle or a calabash. What are the possible implications for gender in a modular system in which the self can be substituted temporarily by a subjectivity of another gender? Some of these gender implications of Afro-Diasporic Transcorporeality are evident in René Depestre's novel Hadriana dans tous mes rêves. In this narrative, Hadriana, a white French woman living in Haiti, is turned into a zombie on her wedding day and becomes the leader of a Voodoo community. Martin Monroe sees in Hadriana's whiteness obvious traces of Depestre's Francophilia, but he also concedes that there might be an element of resistance in Depestre's idealization of Hadriana's beauty by claiming that she might embody a reverse of colonial eroticization of its tropical other. Her aborted marriage begins a non-heteronormative characterization of Hadriana that continues throughout her spiritual evolution. At the outset of the text, Hadriana is associated with Nanaburuku, a loa that is often represented as embodying a primordial androgynous gender. Incapable d'admettre l'arrêt de cœur qui a terrassé Nana au pied de l'autel des Jacmeliennes à l'imagination nécrophile ont réincorporé leur fil en conte des fées. La disparition de son corps du sépulcre était l'épisode qui menait à son terme. C'est ce dans un imaginaire aux prises avec la peur de la mort. The people of Jacmel, unable to accept that a heart attack brought Nana down to the foot of the altar, used their necrophilic imagination to reinsert their daughter into a fairy tale. Her body's disappearance from the sepulchre was the catalyst for such a leap from the fear of death into fantasy. At the end of the novel, she is associated with the male deity of springs. J'étais Simbi, la source, les dieux des Vodou, Maurienne chargée de convoyer à la Jamaïque, une poignée d'immigrants de la région de Jacmel. I was Simbi the spring. The gods of Voodoo ordered me to take a handful of immigrants from Jacmel to Jamaica. The regendering scene in Hadriana's transmutation into various deities is also evident in the powerful trans-amambo experiences at another point in the text. Dès les premières mesures de danse, Saint-Jacques, le majeur, chef de la famille des Ogou, monta le cheval, préviqua le singe. Aussitôt possédé, la mambo improvisa une chanson et harmonie avec la batterie. From the first notes of the dance, Saint James the Greater, the first in the family of the Oguns, mounts Brevica Losange as his horse. In that manner possessed, the mambo improvises a song in harmony with the drums. De Pestre, page 77. This female voodoo priestess's identification with one of the most virile of laws demonstrates how the substitution of the Gourbonange by the metet of another gender can have, as a result of the vaudouisance, corporeal regendering. In addition to her association with Nana Buruku and Simbi la Source, Hadriana is constantly associated with yet another law, Gede, whose domain is life and death. Although his demeanor is humorous, he is known for speaking harsh truths. His portrayal as an undertaker is enhanced with his top hat. His eyeglasses have only one lens, implying vision in this world and the next. His walking cane is a phallus, which acquires a transcorporeal aspect in his hands of his female devotees. Hadriana's death is presented as the responsibility of this law. Un homme alors à l'allure des barons Samedi invita de Guédé présente à ses côtés à prendre la cérsule des mains apostoliques qui les portaient. A man with a resemblance to Baron Samedi invites those Guedes at his side to take the casket from the apostolic hands that carry it. Hadriana's inert body becomes the very representation of death and therefore that of Guédé. À 20 mètres environ du catafalque, la musicienne, dans un accord parfait, imposerait à la fièvre générale un casse-tambour. La foule s'arrête de danser pour mimer la raideur cadavérique de Hadriana Siluet, faisant de la place un canton du royaume des morts. 20 meters around the spectacle, the musicians in unison impose the general fever of the drum. The crowd stops dancing to mimic the corpse-like ugliness of Hadriana Siluet, making the square a settlement of Death's kingdom. Hadriana's identification with this highly sexual mortuary deity is evident in a description of a Voodoo ceremony that foregrounds Geddes' transgression of the binarisms of death or life, masculinity or femininity, terrestrial, celestial, sacred, profane. Au contraire, tambour, vaccine, instrument à vin changerait la chanson de Madame Losange. En saison ensoleillée de la nuit, leur furie musicale fit alterner chaque vivant mort et naissance, râler d'agonie et cris triomphants de l'orgasme. Les volcans musicaux réduisit en cendres l'obstacle légendaire entre Thanatos et Eros. Au-delà des interdits, jetés entre le spermatozoïde des mâles noirs et les ovules des femelles blanches. L'explosion des guédés, vivifiée par le sang chaud, mit les âmes et les corps, verges et vagines, éblouis et harmonie cosmique, avec l'espoir fou d'arracher Nana Siluet à la mort et d'allumer de nouveau l'étoile de sa chair dans notre vie. On the contrary, drums and wind instruments change Madame Losange's song into a sunny season of the night. Their musical fury alternates in each of the living death and birth, cries of agony and exclamations of orgasmic triumph. The musical volcano reduced to ashes, the legendary obstacles between Thanatos and Eros, beyond the prohibitions against the sperm of black males and the eggs of white females. The explosion of Geddes, enlivened by the warm blood, puts the souls and the bodies, the tumescent penises and the vaginas, in cosmic harmony with the crazy hope of rescuing Nana Siluet from death and light again among us the star of a life in her flesh. The transcorporeality found in the religious tradition of Voodoo enables the assumption of cross-gender subjectivities in the secular arena. The Pestre makes use of irony not only by making Hadriana's death take place at the wedding altar, but also by having the wake take place during Carnival. Troops of revelés parade by Hadriana's dead body. The contrast between feast and funeral highlights a reversal of gender norms in the Caribbean carnival tradition of the mariage burlesque. Je m'arrêtai d'abord devant un groupe d'hommes déguisés en femmes pour simuler un état de grossesse avancée. Ils avaient placé sous leur robe de satin vert des oreillers et des cousins. Il avait des poitrines et des fesses devenues calipiques, en appui sur des gourdins, les travestis bouvardaient avec des personnages enveloppés dans les drapes blancs. I stopped in front of a group of men disguised as women. In order to simulate an advanced state of pregnancy, they placed pillows under their satin dresses. They had breasts and buttocks filled for Venus Callipygus. Supported by staffs, the cross-dressers chatted with people dressed in white clothes. Edouard Glissant presents this tradition as one of the few places in which West Indian society is able to critique patriarchal heteronormativity. Il est une occasion en Martinique où hommes et femmes se rencontraient d'accord pour donner une semblable représentation de leur rapport. C'est dans la coutume des mariages burlesques du carnaval. Critique de la structure familiale. L'homme y tient le rôle de l'espouse, le plus souvent ancienne, et la femme celui de l'époux. Un adulte y tenait le rôle d'un enfant ou berceau. Il n'est pas surprenant que le mariage burlesque soit une des rares formes encore vivaces de ces grands questionnements populaires et collectifs du été, qu'était un que ne peut plus être le carnaval martiniquais. There is an occasion in Martinique in which men and women meet in order to give a symbolic representation of their relationship. This is the tradition of the burlesque marriages during Carnival, a critique of family structure. The man has the role of the wife, often pregnant, and the woman that of the husband. An adult has the role of an infant in a crib. It is not surprising that the burlesque marriage is one of the rare forms still alive of that great popular and collective questioning that can be none other than the Martinican carnival. Glissant's Martinican context prevents him from considering Haitian Voodoo as yet another site in which West Indian societies are able to question the dictates of gender and sexual norms. However, this Martinican perspective enables us to consider the ways in which this transcorporeality extends beyond the religious and permeates the entire structure of West Indian society, even of those that have been greatly Europeanized as a result of departmentalization. That the representations of West Indian society in the Pestra are suffused with exoticism has not passed unnoticed by literary critics. In an effort to redeem de Pestra's work, Martin Monroe reminds us exoticism is not always a product of the hegemonic gaze. The processes of mass exile from the Caribbean have rendered the dualistic center-periphery concept of hegemony ever more redundant. In other words, de Pestra's exoticism may be read as a stemming from a deep nostalgia and as a catharsis for the loss and separation from his native Haiti as a result of his exile in France. Unlike the Western idea of the body as the enclosure of the soul, the corps cadavre is an open vessel that finds metaphoric and aesthetic expression in the Kui, Govi, and the Canary containers of Haitian Voodoo. As Thompson explains, one of the most arresting sights for a newcomer into an Afro-Diasporic religious setting is the collection and assortment of ritual containers. The close gathering of numerous bottles and containers on various tiers is a strong organizing principle in the world of Vodou altars. That unifying concept, binding Haitian Rada altars to Dahomean altars in West Africa, precisely entails a constant elevation of a profusion of pottery upon a days, an emphasis on simultaneous assuagement, the liquid in vessels, and exaltation, the ascending structure to the tiers. In fact, some of the most striking art objects of the African diaspora are anthropomorphic receptacles, as noted by Christine Fageretz-Lever in his Christiane Fageretz-Lever in his art exhibit book Receptacles, le Cuba et les peuples apparents du Zaïre ont privilégié de façon presque systématique, mais avec raffinement, la représentation de la tête dans la conception de plus beau de leur réceptacle. Le coup à boire, le vin des palmes. The Cuba and their kin in Zaire have privileged, in an almost codified yet refined manner, the representation of the head in crafting the most beautiful of the receptacles, the cups for drinking palm wine. These cephalomorphic receptacles emblematize the function of the head, and through synecdoche the body, as an open container. This association of the head with such ritual containers is evident in the use of the specific receptacle called potet, P-O-T-E-T-S, literally container heads. This part of the initiation also involves the preparation of the potets as containers for the new selves, repositories for ingredients symbolic of the new union of spirit and human being. Hair, sacrificial food, herbs, and oils. When the initiates join the community for their presentation as unsis, they walk with these pots balanced on their heads and place them in the altar. A symbol of their entering the community as initiated unsi. This representation of the head as an open vessel becomes evident in the association between the material body and the various types of ritual containers in the Pestres Hadriana. J'étais saisi de violentes convulsions internes, tous mes vibrants à se rompre. J'ai sombre dans un cauchemar à l'intérieur de mon cauchemar. J'étais une âme volée. On a séparé mon petit bon ange de mon gros bon ange. On a enfermé la première dans une calebasse pour l'emmener à dos de mule dans une pénitentiaire d'âme dans la montagne de hautes côtes rouges. Le second, la bras lié derrière les dos, a été poussé à coupe de fouet comme un an dans une direction opposée. Tout lien a été rompu entre mes deux formes d'être. I was overcome by violent internal convulsions. All my bones vibrated until they almost cracked. I was in a nightmare inside a nightmare. I was a stolen soul. They separated my T-bon ange from my gros bon ange. They had enclosed the first in a calabash to take it by mule back to the penitentiary of souls in the mountains of Haute Cap Rouge. The second, arm tied behind his back, was flagellated like an ass in the opposite direction. All links were broken between my two forms of being. Here it is possible to see Descartes' important depiction of the African multiple self. This section demonstrates the ways in which aspects of the self might be removable without producing the individual's death. It is also significant how Descartes presents the calabash as one of the receptacles that may be used as substitute for the human body. Davis explains how the separation of the corporeal and immaterial aspects of the self that Descartes describes constitute the phenomenon of zombification. The spirit zombie, or the zombie of the T-bon ange alone, is carefully stored in a jar and may later be magically transmuted into insects, animals, or humans in order to accomplish the particular work of the Bokor. The remaining spiritual components of man, the Nam, the Gros Bon Ange, and the Étoiles, together form the zombie cadaver, the zombie of the flesh. This very detached description of the process of zombification is consistent with Davis's clinical view of zombification as purely the result of neurotoxin poisoning. However, for Descartes, zombification has much more emotive connotations associated with loss of autonomy and spiritual imprisonment. Ce lieu de détention a été aménagé pour recevoir les âmes embouteillées des chrétiens vivants condamnés à une peine privative de liberté spirituelle. Le régime cellulaire consiste à mettre en bouteille l'imaginaire d'individus changés et morts vivants. Les bouteilles que vous allez voir sont des oubliettes en verre cristal, métal, fins, cuir, bois, graisse. This place of detention was prepared to receive the bottled up souls of people condemned to a privation of their spiritual liberty. The practice consisted in bottling up the imaginary of individuals who have become living dead. The bottles that you will see are little forgotten things in glass, crystal, metal, ceramic, leather, wood, and stoneware. It may be argued then that Descartes, like Davis, conceives the T-bon ange as the principal soul and the seat of individuality. However, this view is incongruent with the work of other scholars who believe that the famous zombies are people whose gros bon ange have been captured by some evil Houga, thus becoming living dead. Moreover, apart from zombification, there are various forms of spiritual embottlement, all of which involve the capturing of the gros bon ange, not the T-bon ange. For instance, when the individual willingly decides to bottle up part of his or herself, it is the gros bon ange. A certain amount of immunity against witchcraft may be obtained by requesting an Houga to extract the gros bon ange from the body and to enclose it in a bottle. The soul, removed from its bodily envelope, may either be hidden or buried in a garden or entrusted to the Houga for safekeeping. While this procedure protects the gros bon ange, it does not prevent damage to the material body from which it proceeds. This creates a potentially dangerous situation in which people who have sustained severe bodily injury, either through spells or accidents, will beg to have their gros bon ange liberated from the bottle in order to end their corporeal suffering through death. The goubonnage must be ritually removed from the person's head shortly after death through the ceremony of the sunen, in which the Ougan calls the spirit, or in some cases the name of the dead, then removes the loa and puts it in a pitcher or bottle called a govi. In death, the link between the spirit and its human vessel must be broken, so that the individual spirit can move beyond death and beyond revenge, joining the ancestors under the waters in the mythical place called Guinea. Then a year and day after death, the goubonnage is called up from the water in a ceremony referred to as Rel Monan de l'eau, calling the dead from the water, and installed in a govi clay pot. De Pestre and Davis are correct in their assessment of zombification as constituting the embodiment of one part of the self. However, they are mistaken in saying that this part is the Thibonage, since this and other types of spiritual embodiments involve the containment of the goubonnage. Beyond noticing these important discrepancies, what is important for us here is to consider how, regardless of what aspect of the self is bottled, according to all of these authors, any type of hermetic enclosing of the self is seen as potentially dangerous or associated with death. The fact that one of the most dreaded Afro-Diasporic states of being should be so similar to the Cartesian view of the hermetically sealed soul points to the contestatory and critical relationship between these two philosophical traditions. Curiously, the zombified body of Haitian Voodoo bears striking similarities to the body without organs that Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari elaborate in l'Anti-Oedipe. Instinct des morts, tel est son nom, car le désire aussi cela, la mort, parce que le corps plein de la mort est son moteur immobile, parce que les organes de la vie sont la working machine. Le corps sans organes n'est pas la témoin d'un être originel, pas plus que les restes d'une totalité perdue. Il n'est surtout pas une projection, rien à voir avec le corps propre ou avec une image du corps. C'est le corps sans image, lui improductif, le corps sans organes et de l'antiproduction. Death instinct, that is his name, since the desire desires also that death, because the body full of death is an immobile motor, because life's organs are the working machine. The body without organs is not the witness of an original nothingness, not any more than the remains of a lost totality. It is not a projection. It has nothing to do with the body itself or the image of the body. It is the body without an image. Him, the unproductive. The body without organs is anti-production. In this sense, both the Western and African views of personhood can be seen to coincide. By representing the most abject state of being as that of the body that is deprived of its immaterial elements, organs Gorbonage. Both traditions present an image of the exploited, enslaved, unremunerated, and incomplete worker. Descartes' body as clock and Voodoo's corps cadavre are more similar than previously thought. One of the gourbannages kept by the Boko is that of a same-sex loving male artist. Dans le siphon d'eau des Celtes est détenu un peintre massissi. There is a queer painter imprisoned in the seltzer water siphon. While Fanon insists in Peu Noir, Masque Blanc, that there is no homosexuality in the West Indies, other French West Indian writers such as Descartes and Franck Etienne present same-sex desire as intrinsic to the region. Franck Etienne's Creole novel les Eaux employs the voice of Guédé, the jocular Voodoo law of life, death, overflowing sexuality and bawdiness, to speak openly about the important role that queers play in Voodoo. Papa Guédé tracé vévé ac. Okay, I don't know what language this is. Papa Guédé draws cosmograms with small fine letters for his pleasure on sheets of paper. He plays with words, he sews words, he soldiers words, he hems words, he dresses words and phrases in decorative lace. Papa Guédé has no problem or shyness to say that which he sees, hears, or feels. Guédé's lack of shame allows the articulation of an erotics of women-loving women that turns Madevinaise from derogatory epithet into passionate poetic embellishment. The smell of the divinity along the celestial route of the rainbow, dike root, dike mouth, open up the path as if cutting through the middle of a pineapple. Similarly, Guédé's voice locates the source of sexual desire of men for men in the phallus of Damballa, the snake god, paralleling his earlier beautification of Madevinaise. Franck Etienne explains the effeminacy of the Massissi as divine nature coming about through male devotion to La Sirène. Franck Etienne writes, "Wow, wow, wow, I am hot. I take a deep breath, opening my mouth like the crab to exclaim, hip, hip, hurrah. I am sucking on the head of a serpent. I am twisting the serpent's meat. I am eating the cock's vein. I am groping the tailbone. The mermaid calls the faggot sweet things, honey, cherry, and mounts him. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy." In fact, Franck Etienne's spiralist wordplay leads us to the origins of the word Massissi in the Fon language of Benin and Togo. Mamiwata is about fertility, femaleness, and beauty. Mostly women become mamisis. Men who become mamisis are particularly good-looking and often dress and plait their hair like women. The African counterpart of Haitian La Sirène is Mamiwata, whose initiates, mamisis, read Ma-si-si, embody the femininity of the deity. The font term for initiates of the sea goddess becomes, in Haiti, a referent to male homosexuality. While Franck Etienne's Adjanoume les Eaux honors the full pantheon of Voodoo laws, Dambala's horse is on at the crossroads torn apart. In order to go higher and further, we ask Legba to open the barrier for us. We glide and descend into the fire of Ogun. We are troubling Simbi's water. Gede and La Sirene occupy a primordial role in the narrative. The first because of this unbridled sexuality, and the second because of her associations with same-sex loving male initiates. In Anne Lescott and Lauren Magloire's film Des Hommes et Dieu, Massissi owe their desire not to La Sirene, but to Ezili Danto, the eternal mother spirit, and Eloa, who some consider to be a lesbian. With the backdrop of marketplaces, hair salons, Vodou temples, sacred waterfalls, and dance clubs in Haiti, this groundbreaking film gives voice to a range of Haitian Massissi, most of whom explain their same-sex desire as stemming from their spiritual connection to Danto. There is Blondine, who sells tobacco snuff in Port-au-Prince street market as passers-by mock him for his effeminate demeanor, appearance, and trade. He is tired of the insults in Haiti and would like to move to the Dominican Republic someday. He says that loi get him, the loi spoiled me, and that his father accepts his orientation. Something sacred. There is Dennis, who is seen as the Unfo singing to Danto, Mama kote uye, Mother, where are you? There is Innocente, who also feels he has been the victim of prejudice because people are uneducated. His public humiliations have lessened a great deal since he became an Uga, or Voodoo priest. His family accepts him because it is a baguette mystique caused by Ezili. He has adopted his sister's child, acting out of the maternal instinct with which Erzuli has gifted him. All these men use Creole terms to name their lived experience: Massissi, Madevine, and Caché. None use gay, lesbian, or the closet. However, class divisions in Haiti become clear when the interviewees with a higher degree of education and better command of French come on the screen. Fritzner Anuga says that people are born like this and that placing the origin of same-sex desire on Danto is rubbish. In his Frenchified Creole, he uses French terms to define same-sex desire: homosexuel, homo, and lesbian. Speaking in French, lesbienne. Speaking in French, Erol also speaks of homos and heteros. He explains that queer men say they have been appelés par exil, called by Ezili, in order to avoid Western taboos and find safety in the refuge of la religion de la tolérance. According to his reasoning, men who love men choose Danto rather than her choosing them. They know that she is a mother who accepts her children just the way they are. She will not turn them away, however. His reason does not prevent him from accepting that in the phenomenon of transpossession, something quite transcendental occurs with respect to gender. He acknowledges that when men lend their bodies to Danto, their male bodies are transformed by the femininity of the goddess. Similarly, he believes that Ogun is able to change l'esprit de femme et homme, transform the spirit of a man into a woman's. While the film exposes the hardship of being a sexual minority in a country not always friendly to difference, its narrative is not one of tragedy, but of joy. in the face of adversity and of the hope of overcoming difficulties. For instance, the dancers at the Compa Club underscore the health dangers of casual sex in the country with the highest incidence of HIV infection in the Western Hemisphere. Nevertheless, there is catharsis for his anxiety and the homophobia at the ritual bathing at the St. Jack's waterfalls. The film is to be commended for giving voice to men from a wide range of social classes and professions. However, the film is not always sensitive to the issues of language when it translates Masisi and Madivine in the subtitles using first world terminologies. Furthermore, the film should be criticized for its foregrounding of the troubling issue of causality. That is, what makes these men gay? Perhaps a more helpful question might have been, what accounts for the large numbers of people who are non-heteronormative in these religions? Such a question would have likely yielded a fruitful exploration on the non-binary quality of Vodou, multiplicity beyond the dualism of maleness and femaleness, and an elucidation of how the phenomena of possession allow cross-gender identifications. Unlike the Western idea of a unitary self that is fixed within the body, the Afro-Diasporic philosophical religious tradition conceives the body as a concavity upholding a self that is removable, external, and multiple, allowing for a wider range of subjectivities than the more rigid Western model. The modular Afro-Diasporic discourse of personhood becomes a vehicle for the articulation of non-compliant identities that are usually constrained by normative heteropatriarchy. Haitian literary works like René Depestre's Adriana dans tous mes rêves, Frank Etienne's Melezos, and films like Lescaut and Magloire's D'Homme et Dieu illustrates this modular and transcorporeal view of the African diasporic self in their representations of transpossession, uses of ritual containers, and the phenomenon of zombification. Fun stuff. I think I'm going to need to learn some French. And whatever language that was. Talk soon.